The story of Gilgamesh begins not in a single moment, but in a vast and ancient world that stretches far back into the mists of time, where history and myth become entwined in ways that are almost impossible to separate. To understand this tale, one must first allow the mind to travel gently to Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, where the earliest seeds of civilization were sown and where the very first stories ever written came to life upon clay tablets. Imagine yourself now, slowly drifting back through centuries, past the familiar rhythms of the modern world, until only the quiet sounds of water flowing and the distant calls of ancient voices remain. It is here, in this cradle of civilization, that our journey begins, and it is here that Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, first stepped into legend. The Epic of Gilgamesh is often described as the oldest known story recorded by human hands, older even than the great epics of Homer, older than the myths of Greece, older than Rome, older than the sagas of the Norse or the tales of distant lands. What you are about to hear is not merely the story of a king, but the story of humanity itself, of friendship, of loss, of the search for meaning in the face of mortality. It is a tale carved into the fragile clay of cuneiform tablets, some broken, some incomplete, but together forming a mosaic that has endured across thousands of years. These tablets whisper to us across the gulf of time, reminding us that the questions we ask today, about love, about death, about what it means to live, are the same questions asked by people who lived nearly 5,000 years ago. And so, let us set aside the noise of the present. Let us leave behind the hurried pace of our own lives and walk softly into this ancient world. Picture a vast plain, warmed by the steady sun, where two mighty rivers carve their paths through earth and reed. The Tigris and the Euphrates flow with quiet majesty, their waters nourishing fields of barley and date palms, their currents carrying the lifeblood of a civilization that built great cities from mud brick and stone. In this world, life was both fragile and resilient, for the rivers could bless with abundance or destroy with flood. It was in this balance between creation and destruction that the people of Mesopotamia looked upward to their gods, weaving stories that made sense of their place within the vast order of things. Among these stories rose the figure of Gilgamesh, a man unlike any other, destined to be remembered not only as a king, but as the hero of the world's first great epic. The purpose of this telling is not to rush, nor to dazzle with drama, but to unfold gently, like a soft fabric laid open before the listener. It is meant to carry you, word by word, through the rhythms of the past, until you feel as though you are resting beside a fire in an ancient hall, hearing the tale spoken in the slow cadence of a storyteller's voice. Let the details wash over you, not demanding attention, but lulling you into a calm awareness, a state where the boundary between waking thought and drifting dream begins to blur. For the Epic of Gilgamesh, though it is full of battles, gods, and journeys to distant lands, is also a meditation on the human soul, on the longing for friendship and the inevitability of death, on the quiet truth that even the greatest among us must one day rest. As you listen, you may find that the story does not unfold in straight lines but in circles, patterns, and echoes, much like the flow of the rivers themselves. There will be moments of grandeur, where the strength of kings and the anger of gods shake the world, and there will be moments of stillness, where grief and wisdom sit quietly together in the silence. This balance is what makes the tale so enduring, for it reflects the balance of life itself. Gilgamesh is both more than human and yet entirely human, larger than life and yet haunted by the same shadows that fall upon us all. He is at once a symbol of power and a mirror of our own hearts. Tonight, or whenever you choose to hear this tale, think of yourself as part of a long chain of listeners stretching back through time. Once, in dimly lit chambers, storytellers would have spoken these words aloud by firelight, their voices carrying over the hush of those gathered to listen. Later, scribes pressed reeds into wet clay, line after line, so that the story might endure even when the voice was gone. And now, across thousands of years, the story reaches you, carried not by clay but by sound, yet still with the same intent, to connect, to remind, to comfort. There is a kind of immortality in this, for as long as the story is told, Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu live again, walking among us in imagination. This is the beginning, then, not only of one tale, but of storytelling itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh does not simply recount the deeds of a king. It invites us to reflect upon what it means to be alive, to struggle, to love, to lose, and to search for answers that may always remain just out of reach. As we set forth together into this journey, let us move with patience and with quiet wonder, for the path is long, and it is best walked slowly. The city of Uruk awaits us, its walls rising high, its people murmuring prayers, its king restless and proud. Soon, we will meet him, and soon we will meet the wild man who will become his dearest friend. But for now, breathe softly, let your thoughts settle, and know that you are entering a story as old as time itself. To understand the story of Gilgamesh, we must first spend time in the land that gave birth to him, the place the ancients called Mesopotamia. The very name means the land between rivers, and it was here, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, that humanity first gathered in great numbers, building cities and raising temples that touched the skies. It is not enough to know that this was simply a fertile plain, for Mesopotamia was more than geography. It was a world alive with rhythms, the rising and falling of the rivers, the shimmering heat of the plains, the whisper of reeds swaying in the wind, and the steady work of men and women who shaped mud into bricks, who planted fields of barley, who pressed dates into sweet wine. Life here moved to the pace of the seasons, and each season carried with it the promise of life and the threat of destruction. The rivers were both friend and enemy. In their floods lay the possibility of plenty, but also the danger of loss. Farmers knew that their lives depended on the waters, and so they watched the skies, prayed to the gods, and learned to live with both abundance and disaster. From this fragile balance arose a belief in higher powers, forces that governed not only the weather and the land, but the fate of men and kings. To live in Mesopotamia was to live with a constant awareness of the divine, for every aspect of life was tied to gods who walked invisibly among their people. The temples that rose in the cities were not merely places of worship. They were bridges between heaven and earth, massive stairways of baked brick reaching toward the sky, known as ziggurats. To climb their steps was to feel closer to eternity, and to stand at their base was to feel the shadow of the gods. In this world, the city of Uruk stood as one of the greatest wonders. Its walls stretched far and wide, encircling a place where art, trade, and devotion flourished. Merchants moved along its streets, carrying goods from distant lands, while priests tended sacred fires that never ceased to burn. Craftsmen shaped intricate seals, their carvings pressed into wet clay to mark ownership and promise. Scribes bent over tablets, their reeds leaving behind sharp-edged impressions that captured the memory of laws, prayers, and tales. And in the air hung the mingling scents of incense, of freshly baked bread, of animals herded through the gates at dawn. Uruk was alive, and through its beating heart ran a belief that humanity's place in the universe was guided by the will of gods. To speak of Mesopotamia is also to speak of its people, for they were the first to shape the tools of writing, the first to create a calendar, the first to divide the heavens into constellations that still bear names familiar to us today. Their days were filled with labor, but their nights were filled with stories, tales whispered under the stars or carved into tablets by careful hands. These stories gave meaning to the unpredictable flow of life, offering lessons in courage, humility, and the strange relationship between man and the divine. It was out of this soil, rich not only with grain but with imagination, that the Epic of Gilgamesh took root. The tone of daily life was both ordinary and extraordinary. One could walk through the market and hear the cries of vendors selling dates or copper, but one could also glance upward to see towering temples that promised access to powers beyond comprehension. A woman grinding grain in her home might stop to murmur a prayer to the goddess Inanna, while a fisherman pulling nets from the river might offer thanks to the god Enki for the waters that sustained him. Even the simplest act was threaded with reverence, as though every step taken beneath the Mesopotamian sun was watched and weighed by divine eyes. In such a world, the boundary between mortal and immortal, between earthly and eternal, was thin and easily crossed through ritual, story, or dream. Mesopotamian belief was not rooted in the idea of a single god, but in a great assembly of deities, each with their own character, their own powers, their own domains. Anu, Lord of the heavens, reigned above. Enlil, god of the air, wielded storms. Enki, master of wisdom and water, guided mankind with cleverness. Inanna, radiant goddess of love and war, brought both passion and destruction in her wake. To live among these gods was to accept that human life was small in comparison, yet also precious, for the gods themselves often quarreled, desired, and erred. Their world was not one of perfection, but of power, and mankind's role was to honor, to endure, and sometimes to resist. As we imagine Mesopotamia, we should not picture silence, but a chorus of sounds: the braying of donkeys, the clatter of wheels upon stone streets, the chants of priests, the hammering of craftsmen, the murmur of families gathered in courtyards as dusk fell. With night came the stars, and with stars came stories. Some were told to children to lull them to sleep. Others were told in temple rituals to bind the community together, and some, like the story of Gilgamesh, were written so that generations far beyond the lives of their first listeners could still hear them. The tale was born out of a culture that valued memory, continuity, and the deep human need to give meaning to the fleeting span of life. And so, the land between rivers was not merely a backdrop, but a living participant in the story of Gilgamesh. Its fields, its floods, its temples, and its people all shaped the king of Uruk and the friend who would come to walk beside him. As the waters flowed, so too did the tales, winding their way across centuries until they reached us. When we speak of Mesopotamia, we are not simply recounting facts about geography or trade. We are stepping into a dreamscape where every grain of sand might hold the echo of an ancient prayer, and every gust of wind might carry the voice of a forgotten god. The land itself breathes through the story, and the story cannot be separated from the land. This is the setting, then, into which Gilgamesh will stride, a world of rivers and temples, of gods and men, of abundance and loss. It is important to pause here, to linger in the atmosphere of Mesopotamia, for only by understanding this world can we truly understand the king who ruled within it. Soon we will see his face, hear his voice, and learn of his deeds, but first we must let the land shape our imagination. Mesopotamia was the cradle, and from its cradle rose not just a man, but a legend whose shadow still stretches across time. Before we arrive at the deeds of Gilgamesh himself, it is worth pausing to consider how his story came to us at all, and why it has lasted longer than almost any other tale known to humankind. Long before there were tablets of clay marked with wedge-shaped signs, there were voices, and those voices carried memory across generations. In ancient Mesopotamia, the art of storytelling was not merely entertainment, it was preservation. It was a way of binding community together, of teaching values, of recalling the names of gods and kings. The earliest stories were carried like fragile vessels upon the breath of singers, passed down in long recitations that blended history with myth and wisdom with wonder. One could imagine a gathering at twilight, a storyteller seated among listeners, recounting the exploits of heroes and the favor or fury of the gods. The story would change in each telling, bending to the memory and artistry of the speaker, yet its heart remained intact. This was the beginning of the epic tradition, a tradition that would eventually give rise to the tale of Gilgamesh. The step from spoken word to written word was one of humanity's greatest leaps. It was in Mesopotamia that writing itself was born, through the patient pressing of reeds into soft clay. At first, the marks recorded simple transactions, numbers, measures of grain, records of trade. But in time, these signs grew into a system capable of carrying thought itself, preserving the voices of men and women who otherwise would have vanished with the wind. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script, became the medium by which myths and prayers, hymns and contracts, could endure far beyond the span of a single life. And it was through cuneiform that the story of Gilgamesh, first spoken in gatherings by firelight, was carved into permanence. Yet permanence in the ancient world was never absolute. Clay could break, tablets could be lost, entire libraries could crumble into dust. What we possess of Gilgamesh is incomplete, fragments scattered across time, pieced together like shards of pottery. Many lines are missing, some passages remain mysteries, and others must be reconstructed from echoes in later traditions. And yet, even through this incompleteness, the epic endures with surprising clarity. It is as though the story itself refuses to die, clinging to memory with the tenacity of the very themes it explores: mortality, grief, friendship, and the search for meaning. To reflect on this is to recognize a deep truth. Human lives are fleeting, yet our words, our stories, and the impressions we leave behind may outlast us. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not merely a tale about an ancient king. It is also a symbol of the endurance of human imagination. The scribes who copied it, the storytellers who recited it, the archaeologists who unearthed it, and now the listeners who hear it. Each has played a part in carrying the story forward. Like the river that flows without ceasing, the tale has found its way through obstacles and silences, still reaching ears today. When we consider the origins of the epic tradition, it is helpful to imagine the world as it was before written language. In such a world, memory itself was the great library. A singer or storyteller had to hold countless lines in their mind, preserving them with rhythm and repetition. The steady beat of a drum, the rise and fall of a chant, the structure of repeated phrases, these were tools of memory. And so, the earliest epics had a musical quality, their words designed not only to tell, but to be remembered. Gilgamesh may once have lived within such performances, his story carried in the cadence of voices, flowing like water from one generation to the next. When eventually these words found their way into clay, they acquired a new kind of life. Writing fixed the story, giving it weight and permanence, but also a stillness that oral tradition never had. A tablet does not breathe or forget. It waits silently until eyes fall upon it again. In this way, the Epic of Gilgamesh became both fragile and enduring. Fragile, because a single broken tablet could erase entire chapters. Enduring, because those that survived carried their words unchanged across millennia. We owe much of our knowledge of Gilgamesh to the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, where thousands of tablets were gathered in the 7th century BCE. When fire consumed the palace, many of the tablets were baked harder by the flames, preserving them by accident. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered the ruins, the story of Gilgamesh emerged from the soil once more, astonishing a modern world that had long forgotten his name. This resurrection of the story is itself part of its epic journey. For nearly 2,000 years, Gilgamesh lay silent, unknown to the civilizations that rose and fell after Mesopotamia. Then, piece by piece, his voice returned. Each fragment, each recovered line, was like a heartbeat, reviving a king who had once ruled in both legend and reality. There is something profoundly moving in this, that the words pressed into clay by hands long turned to dust still speak, still breathe meaning into our present. The origins of the epic tradition remind us that stories are bridges. They connect the living to the dead, the past to the present, the fleeting moment to the endless flow of time. In listening to Gilgamesh, we do not only hear of a king and his friend. We hear the echo of all those who kept his memory alive. The shepherd who first recited his name, the scribe who etched the signs, the scholar who pieced fragments together, the voice that carries it now. They are all part of one long chain of storytellers. And as you listen, you too become part of this chain, part of a tradition older than any nation, older than most of the monuments that stand today. In this way, the story of Gilgamesh is not just about immortality, it is immortality. It is proof that memory can defy oblivion, that words can cross gulfs of time greater than we can easily comprehend. Even as cities fell, as empires dissolved, as languages faded, the story endured. And in hearing it, we are reminded of the power of stories in our own lives. We may not carve words into clay, but the stories we tell, the memories we preserve, may travel further than we ever imagine. So let us hold this thought as we move forward. The Epic of Gilgamesh is both story and symbol. It teaches us about kings and gods, but it also teaches us about the endurance of storytelling itself. As you listen, imagine the countless voices that have carried these words before you. Imagine the quiet rooms where scribes bent over tablets. Imagine the desert winds blowing softly over buried libraries. Imagine the hands that lifted shattered pieces of clay and realized that an ancient king still had something to say. All of this is part of the epic, and all of this prepares us to meet Gilgamesh not merely as a figure from the past, but as a living presence within a tradition that refuses to fade. When at last we turn our gaze toward Gilgamesh himself, we do not see a figure of quiet modesty or simple humility. We see instead a man who towers above his people, a king whose name was spoken with awe and with dread, a ruler who embodied both greatness and excess. The tablets describe him as 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, a mixture of heaven and earth bound together in a single frame. From his divine mother, Nin's son, came wisdom, insight, and strength beyond the ordinary. From his mortal father came his place among men, his throne in Uruk, and the human frailties that no power could entirely erase. In him, the divine and the human did not blend smoothly, but collided, giving rise to a restless spirit that could never be satisfied, neither by power nor by pleasure. This was Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, the man who would one day wander to the very edge of the world in search of answers. To imagine him in his earliest days as ruler is to picture both splendor and imbalance. The city of Uruk thrived under his reign, its walls strong, its temples radiant, its people numerous. Trade flowed in and out of the gates, festivals filled the streets with song, and the power of Uruk became known across the lands. Yet beneath this prosperity lay unease, for Gilgamesh was not a gentle shepherd of his people. His strength was unmatched, his will unchallenged, and his desires unchecked. He demanded what he pleased, took what he wished, and ruled with an intensity that left little room for compassion. Some accounts say that the young men of Uruk feared being pressed into endless contests of strength, while the women feared the gaze of their restless king. What was divinity in him brought greatness, but what was human brought excess, and the people, though proud of their mighty city, began to murmur prayers for relief. And yet, to look upon Gilgamesh was to see something beyond mortal limits. His shoulders were broad, his stride immense, his face filled with a commanding presence that seemed to radiate power itself. To his people, he was both protector and oppressor, a figure to be admired and feared. In one breath, he could inspire courage, and in the next, despair. It is this duality, this complexity of strength and flaw, that makes him one of the most enduring characters in ancient literature. He was not written as a perfect king, nor as a tyrant alone, but as a man caught between extremes, destined to learn through trial and sorrow what it meant to be human. The poets tell us that Gilgamesh, for all his might, was restless. No feast satisfied him. No contest quenched his hunger for recognition. He longed not only to rule but to leave a mark, a legacy that would endure after death had claimed him. Even in the days of his early reign, when he seemed untouchable, this yearning was present. His gaze often lifted toward the horizon, as though searching for something beyond the walls of Uruk. Within him, the seeds of his later quest were already stirring. A man of such strength could defeat enemies, build monuments, and command armies, but none of these silenced the quiet voice of mortality that whispered in the heart of every human being, even one born part divine. To the people of Uruk, this restlessness was not a comfort. For while Gilgamesh sought to satisfy his need for greatness, they bore the weight of his actions. They prayed to the gods for balance, for a force that might temper their king's might. In their cries, there was both respect and desperation, for they knew they lived under the shadow of a man too powerful to oppose. And the gods, ever watchful, would soon answer those cries. But for now, we remain with Gilgamesh in his early days, when his arrogance still reigned unchecked. If we were to walk through Uruk in those times, we would feel his presence in every corner of the city. His hand was in the building of its walls, its temples, its palaces. His energy seemed boundless, and his achievements undeniable. The great walls of Uruk, stretching farther than the eye could see, stood as monuments to his ambition. Each brick seemed to carry his name, his pride, his desire for permanence. To climb the walls, to look out across the plains, was to feel the weight of a king determined that nothing should outlast him except his works. Yet within this greatness, loneliness lingered. For power without balance isolates, and even in the midst of his glory, Gilgamesh stood apart, unmatched and unchallenged, a man surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. There is a quiet irony in his story, that the one who would later mourn so deeply for a friend began his reign without knowing true companionship at all. His strength separated him. His pride built invisible walls higher even than those of Uruk. He could command obedience. He could inspire fear, but he could not compel the kind of bond that softens the heart. That bond would come later, unexpected and transformative, but in these first days, Gilgamesh remained untempered, a flame that burned too brightly and too fiercely. It is important to see him in this light, not as a hero already formed, but as a man in need of shaping. The epic does not begin with his perfection, but with his imperfection. It shows us a king who must be tested, who must be humbled, who must be taught through the language of loss and companionship. By painting him first as arrogant and restless, the story prepares us for the depth of his transformation. For it is only when we know how flawed he was that we can appreciate how deeply he grew. And so, in these early moments of his tale, Gilgamesh stands upon the walls of Uruk, gazing outward, restless and unsatisfied. His people whisper prayers for the gods to hear, asking for relief, for balance, for something to soften the heart of their king. The gods listen, and their answer will soon arrive in the form of a man born not in a palace, but in the wilderness. But before that meeting, before that friendship that would shape both their lives, we must hold here with Gilgamesh as he is, mighty, arrogant, brilliant, and flawed. A king both admired and feared, a man both divine and human, a restless soul whose journey was only beginning. The prayers of the people of Uruk did not vanish into silence. They rose upward, carried on the evening winds, carried on the murmurs of festivals and the whispers of mothers to their children at night. In the temples, offerings were placed with trembling hands, and priests lifted their voices toward the heavens. The gods, who were ever attentive to the balance of the world, heard the unrest that had spread beneath the golden walls of Uruk. They had given Gilgamesh strength beyond compare, wisdom greater than ordinary men, and dominion over a flourishing city. Yet even the gifts of the gods, when left unchecked, can grow into burdens for mortals. And so, in their council, the divine powers resolved that something must be done. Gilgamesh, mighty though he was, could not rule alone with only his restless will to guide him. The solution was not to strike him down, nor to strip him of his power, but to create for him an equal, someone who might stand at his side, challenge him, and in so doing, temper his excesses. The answer would not come from within the city, but from the wild, the unshaped world beyond its gates. And so the gods formed Enkidu. He was not born in a palace, nor in a temple, nor in the comfort of a noble house. He was shaped from the clay of the earth itself, molded by the hands of creation, a being as strong as the animals he would live among, as free as the winds that moved across the plains. Enkidu was sent into the world not as a polished man, but as one who belonged to nature. His hair grew long like the lion's mane. His body was clothed not in woven fabric, but in the grasses and dust of the wilderness. He drank from the watering holes with the gazelles. He grazed the fields with the cattle. He ran with the herds as though he were one of them. In him, there was no separation between man and beast, no distinction between the breath of humanity and the rhythm of the earth. He was a creature of innocence and strength, untouched by cities, untouched by kings, untouched by the restlessness that plagued Gilgamesh. To picture Enkidu in those early days is to imagine a life that was raw and unshaped, yet profoundly peaceful. When the lions roared, he did not fear them, for he was their brother. When the deer bounded across the plains, he followed, not as hunter, but as kin. His hands dug into the soil as though he had known it forever. He was both protector and disruptor of the natural world, driving hunters from their traps, freeing animals from the snares of men. Where Enkidu walked, the wilderness flourished, for he belonged wholly to it. The people who glimpsed him from afar spoke of a giant covered in hair, strong and swift, who could dismantle their labor and scatter their herds. To them he was both marvel and threat, something that stirred both wonder and fear. The gods had indeed crafted a figure to stand against Gilgamesh, but first Enkidu belonged to the wild, a child of nature rather than of civilization. And yet, the story does not leave him in the wild forever. For though the wilderness was his home, his destiny was tied to Uruk, to the restless king whose heart needed balance. Word spread to Gilgamesh himself of this wild man who ran with the beasts, who shattered hunters' traps, who lived free of rule and order. Gilgamesh, ever eager to test his might, was intrigued by the thought of such a rival. A man fashioned from the wilderness, equal in strength, was a challenge unlike any he had yet known. But the path that would bring Enkidu from the plains to the city was not simple. It would be shaped by chance encounters and by the subtle weaving of human influence. One such moment came when a trapper, weary from the constant destruction of his work, sought counsel. Again and again, Enkidu had ruined the hunter's livelihood, releasing the animals from nets, filling the watering holes with his presence, making the wild creatures unafraid of man. Desperate, the trapper traveled into Uruk to seek guidance. There he described the wild man to his father, and his father counseled him to go to Gilgamesh. The king, hearing of this rival, did not laugh or dismiss the tale. Instead, he advised the hunter to take a woman with him, one skilled in the arts of intimacy, who might tame the wildness and Enkidu not with chains, but with the subtle bonds of human connection. Thus the trapper returned with Shamhat, a temple woman, whose presence carried both allure and wisdom, whose role would prove pivotal in the transformation of Enkidu. The meeting between Enkidu and Shamhat stands as one of the most profound in the epic, for it is not a battle of strength, but a gentle turning of one world into another. When Enkidu approached the watering hole, as he had done countless times before, he found her waiting. Her beauty was unlike anything he had seen among the beasts. She called to him not with force, but with tenderness, drawing him near, offering him what the wilderness could not provide. For 6 days and 7 nights, they remained together, and in that time, something shifted within Enkidu. The animals who had once accepted him as one of their own now turned away. They fled from him, sensing that he had crossed into a new realm. He was no longer wholly of the wild, no longer only their brother. He had tasted the world of human connection, and he could not return unchanged. From Shamhat, Enkidu learned the ways of men. She spoke to him of food beyond the grasses of the field, of drink beyond the waterholes. She taught him to eat bread, to drink ale, to sit in companionship with others. These simple acts, taken for granted by city dwellers, were monumental steps for a man of the wilderness. With each lesson, Enkidu moved farther from his old life and closer to the one awaiting him in Uruk. His strength remained, his heart still beat with the rhythm of the earth, but now he bore the marks of civilization. The gods had created him to be an equal to Gilgamesh, and now, guided by Shamhat, he was being shaped for that role. It is a quiet, almost tender irony that the gods did not answer the cries of Uruk with punishment or destruction, but with companionship. To balance the arrogance of a king, they gave him not an enemy to destroy, but a friend to know. Enkidu's birth in the wild and his transformation through human contact reveal the deeper theme of the epic, that strength alone is not enough, that kingship demands not only power but also understanding. Before Enkidu would meet Gilgamesh, before their bond would reshape the destiny of both, he first had to walk the delicate path between wilderness and civilization. The man who had run with animals would soon walk through the gates of Uruk, not as a beast, not as a captive, but as one destined to be both rival and companion to the restless king. When Enkidu had at last stepped across the invisible threshold that separated wilderness from civilization, he did not leave behind all that he was. The earth still clung to him, its memory alive in his heartbeat, its strength alive in his limbs. Yet the path now led him toward the city, toward the destiny that had been spoken for him before he ever drew breath. Shamhat, who had guided his first steps into the world of human life, now led him closer to Uruk, closer to Gilgamesh, closer to the encounter that would change both their lives forever. She walked with him, telling him of the city that shone with splendor, of the walls that stood like mountains, of the temples that glistened in the sun. To Enkidu, who had known only the open plain, these words were strange, yet they stirred something within him, a curiosity, a faint yearning to see what lay beyond the horizon. As they journeyed, Shamhat taught him more of what it meant to be human. She placed bread before him, and though at first he resisted, for he had never known such food. She encouraged him until he ate. She gave him ale to drink, and though it was unfamiliar, it warmed him, loosened his spirit, and filled him with laughter. Slowly, the wildness within him gave way to new ways of being. His hair was washed, his body anointed, his form clothed in garments woven by human hands. No longer a beast among beasts, Enkidu began to look upon himself as something different, something new. And though he still possessed the might of the wilderness, the gods had shaped him for another purpose, one that could only be fulfilled in Uruk. But word of Enkidu's existence had already spread. Hunters spoke of him to the people. The trapper whispered his tale to all who would listen, and eventually the murmurs reached the ears of Gilgamesh himself. The king, restless as ever, did not ignore the story. To hear of another man, as strong as himself, a figure who could wrestle lions, who could scatter hunters and trample traps, was both a challenge and a spark of interest. Gilgamesh had long believed himself unmatched. Now there was talk of an equal. Pride stirred in him, and he declared that when Enkidu entered the city, they would meet in combat. He did not imagine a friend or a companion. He imagined a rival, someone to overcome, a new victory to claim. Yet the gods had woven the strands of fate differently, and their first meeting would not end as Gilgamesh expected. When Enkidu at last came near the gates of Uruk, the city stretched before him like a vision from another world. The walls rose high, gleaming in the light, encircling towers and temples that shimmered with the devotion of centuries. The streets were alive with people, the air filled with the hum of voices, the scent of food, the rhythm of life in its many forms. To Enkidu, who had known only the quiet of the wild and the sound of animals at dawn, this was overwhelming. Yet Shamhat stayed close, guiding him, assuring him, reminding him of the path the gods had set before him. He would not come to Uruk as a beast. He would come as a man, ready to meet the king whose destiny was bound to his own. It was on a day of celebration, when Gilgamesh sought to exercise once more his unchecked will, that their paths crossed. The people, weary of their king's arrogance, whispered among themselves that at last there was one who might stand against him. When Gilgamesh moved through the streets with the intention of fulfilling one of his own desires, Enkidu stood in his way. A wall of flesh and strength, he barred the king's path, his voice raised not in reverence, but in defiance. No one else in Uruk had dared such a thing. For the first time, Gilgamesh was confronted by a figure who would not yield, who would not step aside, who did not tremble before his presence. What followed was not a polite exchange of words, but a clash of titans. Gilgamesh, incensed by the defiance, grappled with Enkidu. Their struggle shook the very streets, dust rising, walls echoing with the sound of their collision. The people gathered, astonished, for never before had they seen their king opposed. Never before had they witnessed another man equal in might. The two wrestled fiercely, each straining against the other, neither willing to submit. It seemed as though the city itself held its breath, uncertain of the outcome. Strength met strength, will met will, and the balance of destiny shifted with every movement. At last, after a struggle that seemed unending, Gilgamesh forced Enkidu to the ground. His strength prevailed, if only by a margin. Yet what might have ended in bitterness instead transformed into something greater. For in the moment of defeat, Enkidu did not feel only anger, and Gilgamesh did not feel only triumph. Something passed between them, an unspoken recognition, a spark of understanding. Gilgamesh, who had long been restless and alone, saw in Enkidu not merely a rival, but a mirror of himself. And Enkidu, who had left the wilderness and entered the world of men, saw in Gilgamesh not only a king but the equal he had been created to find. Their struggle ended not in enmity, but in laughter. From exhaustion, from recognition, from the sheer wonder of finding one another, the two men stood as companions rather than foes. The people of Uruk, who had feared their king and prayed for relief, now looked upon the scene with awe. The gods had answered their prayers, though not as they expected. They had not diminished Gilgamesh's strength, but had provided him a counterpart, a companion who could match him, temper him, and walk beside him. From that day, Gilgamesh and Enkidu were inseparable. Their bond was forged not in softness, but in trial, not in gentle friendship, but in the fire of struggle. And yet, it was true friendship, the kind that neither wealth nor power could purchase, the kind that transformed both men. Gilgamesh, who had been arrogant and restless, now had someone to share his path, someone to confide in, someone who could stand beside him without fear. Enkidu, who had been alone in the wild, now had purpose beyond himself, a place in the city, and a brotherhood that gave meaning to his transformation. It is here, in the heart of Uruk, amid the dust of their first struggle, that the great story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu truly begins. The restless king and the wild man, bound by fate, bound by strength, and bound by friendship. Two men who together would challenge monsters, defy gods, and search for truths beyond the reach of mortals. Two men whose story, though born in clay tablets thousands of years ago, still speaks to us of companionship, of transformation, and of the fragile line that runs between humanity and divinity. The friendship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, once formed, grew quickly into a bond so deep that neither man was whole without the other. They had met as rivals, each testing the strength of the other, but what began in combat transformed into trust, and what began in opposition became unity. From that day forward, they walked side by side through the streets of Uruk, their presence a marvel to the people who watched. No longer was Gilgamesh a solitary king towering above his subjects with unchecked arrogance, and no longer was Enkidu a wild man wandering without purpose. Together, they seemed to balance one another, their strengths complementing, their flaws tempered. The people of Uruk, who had once prayed desperately for relief from the excess of their king, now looked upon this unlikely pair with a sense of quiet hope. Where Gilgamesh strode with command, Enkidu walked with steadiness. Where Enkidu carried the raw strength of nature, Gilgamesh carried the refined authority of kingship. Together they embodied a harmony that neither could achieve alone. Their days became filled with conversation, shared meals, and long walks upon the walls of Uruk, where they gazed out across the open lands. Enkidu spoke often of the wilderness he had left behind, of the animals that once ran beside him, of the rivers that had quenched his thirst. Gilgamesh listened, for though he was restless and mighty, these tales of the wild stirred his imagination. He had always sought greatness, yet his greatness had been bound within the walls of his city. Enkidu's words opened a different horizon, a world vast and untamed, a world that seemed to call both of them forward. In return, Gilgamesh spoke of his visions of glory, of deeds that might be sung for generations, of monuments that would outlast the crumbling of stone. Enkidu, though simpler in his desires, began to feel the pull of that vision. His life in the wilderness had been free, but it had also been transient, without legacy. Now, with Gilgamesh at his side, he felt the stirrings of destiny. It was not long before Gilgamesh, still restless, proposed a bold course. He spoke of Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, a monstrous figure appointed by the god Enlil to protect the sacred trees. Humbaba's face was said to strike fear into the hearts of men, his roar like a flood, his breath like fire. No mortal dared to enter the cedar forest, and no one had ever returned to tell of victory against the guardian. To Gilgamesh, this was not a reason for caution but an invitation. He saw in Humbaba a challenge worthy of his strength, a foe whose defeat would ensure his name endured beyond death. For Gilgamesh, this was no mere adventure but the promise of immortality through reputation. If he and Enkidu could cut down the cedars and overcome the guardian, their story would be carved into the memory of generations. When he spoke of this plan to Enkidu, the wild man hesitated. Enkidu knew the power of Humbaba, for he had roamed near the edges of the forest in his life among the beasts. He knew that Humbaba was not simply a monster but a force of nature, wrapped in terror and placed there by divine will. Enkidu, who had once lived in harmony with the natural world, felt a shiver of caution. To strike against Humbaba was to strike against the balance of creation. Yet he also knew that the gods had shaped him for Gilgamesh, and in their bond, he felt both duty and desire. Though he feared the guardian, he could not leave Gilgamesh to face the danger alone. His loyalty was stronger than his fear, and so he agreed to the journey, even as unease lingered in his heart. The people of Uruk, when they heard of their king's intention, were filled with dread. They knew Humbaba's terror, they knew the forest was not meant for mortals. They tried to dissuade Gilgamesh, urging him to be content with the greatness of Uruk, to find satisfaction in the splendor already achieved. But Gilgamesh was unmoved. The voices of caution only sharpened his determination. He declared that death comes for all, but the name of the brave endures. If he should fall in the cedar forest, at least his deeds would be remembered. And if he should triumph, Uruk would stand taller than any city upon the earth. The elders, seeing his resolve, offered their blessings, though their hearts were heavy. They counseled him to honor the gods, to take Enkidu as his guide, and to remember that even kings must bow before fate. Before their departure, Gilgamesh sought the blessing of his mother, the goddess Ninsun. She, wise and sorrowful, performed rituals and prayers, offering incense and sacrifice to the sun god Shamash, who might aid them on their perilous journey. She embraced Enkidu as a son, recognizing that he, too, was bound to this path, that his fate was now intertwined with her child's. With her blessings upon them, Gilgamesh and Enkidu prepared to set forth. The city watched as the two companions armed themselves with weapons forged for the task, great axes and swords that gleamed with the promise of battle. The gates of Uruk opened, and the two men stepped beyond, leaving behind the safety of their city, stepping into a world of danger and legend. It is here that their bond deepened most of all. As they walked together across the plains, through valleys and hills, they shared their fears, their hopes, their laughter. Gilgamesh, though brave in his words, sometimes trembled at the thought of Humbaba's might, and in those moments Enkidu steadied him, reminding him that they faced the trial together. And when Enkidu faltered, burdened by his knowledge of the guardian's terror, Gilgamesh lifted his spirits, speaking of glory, of songs yet unwritten. Their companionship was not one of perfection, but of balance. Where one faltered, the other gave strength, and where one soared, the other gave grounding. In this harmony lay the true gift of the gods. The journey itself was long, and each night they built a camp beneath the stars. They lay upon the earth, speaking softly of the deeds to come, and when sleep overcame them, dreams arrived to guide their steps. Gilgamesh dreamt of mountains collapsing, of lightning flashing across the sky, of a being who stood beside him with the strength of the gods. Each time he woke, disturbed and uncertain, Enkidu interpreted the dreams, telling him they were signs of victory, that Shamash himself was on their side. These dreams, and Enkidu's steady voice, calmed the restless heart of the king, turning his fear into determination. Thus, step by step, Gilgamesh and Enkidu moved closer to the cedar forest, closer to the trial that awaited them. Behind them lay Uruk, its people anxious yet hopeful, its gods watchful. Before them lay the towering trees, the shadowed paths, and the guardian whose roar was said to shake the heavens. The stage was set, the companions prepared, their bond tested by distance and strengthened by trust. What awaited them in the forest was more than a battle. It was the crucible in which their friendship would be proven, their courage measured, and their destinies sealed. The friendship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, once formed, grew quickly into a bond so deep that neither man was whole without the other. They had met as rivals, each testing the strength of the other. But what began in combat transformed into trust, and what began in opposition became unity. From that day forward, they walked side by side through the streets of Uruk, their presence a marvel to the people who watched. No longer was Gilgamesh a solitary king towering above his subjects with unchecked arrogance, and no longer was Enkidu a wild man wandering without purpose. Together, they seemed to balance one another, their strengths complementing, their flaws tempered. The people of Uruk, who had once prayed desperately for relief from the excess of their king, now looked upon this unlikely pair with a sense of quiet hope. Where Gilgamesh strode with command, Enkidu walked with steadiness. Where Enkidu carried the raw strength of nature, Gilgamesh carried the refined authority of kingship. Together they embodied a harmony that neither could achieve alone. Their days became filled with conversation, shared meals, and long walks upon the walls of Uruk, where they gazed out across the open lands. Enkidu spoke often of the wilderness he had left behind, of the animals that once ran beside him, of the rivers that had quenched his thirst. Gilgamesh listened, for though he was restless and mighty, these tales of the wild stirred his imagination. He had always sought greatness, yet his greatness had been bound within the walls of his city. Enkidu's words opened a different horizon, a world vast and untamed, a world that seemed to call both of them forward. In return, Gilgamesh spoke of his visions of glory, of deeds that might be sung for generations, of monuments that would outlast the crumbling of stone. Enkidu, though simpler in his desires, began to feel the pull of that vision. His life in the wilderness had been free, but it had also been transient, without legacy. Now, with Gilgamesh at his side, he felt the stirrings of destiny. It was not long before Gilgamesh, still restless, proposed a bold course. He spoke of Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, a monstrous figure appointed by the god Enlil to protect the sacred trees. Humbaba's face was said to strike fear into the hearts of men, his roar like a flood, his breath like fire. No mortal dared to enter the cedar forest, and no one had ever returned to tell of victory against the guardian. To Gilgamesh, this was not a reason for caution but an invitation. He saw in Humbaba a challenge worthy of his strength, a foe whose defeat would ensure his name endured beyond death. For Gilgamesh, this was no mere adventure but the promise of immortality through reputation. If he and Enkidu could cut down the cedars and overcome the guardian, their story would be carved into the memory of generations. When he spoke of this plan to Enkidu, the wild man hesitated. Enkidu knew the power of Humbaba, for he had roamed near the edges of the forest in his life among the beasts. He knew that Humbaba was not simply a monster but a force of nature, wrapped in terror and placed there by divine will. Enkidu, who had once lived in harmony with the natural world, felt a shiver of caution. To strike against Humbaba was to strike against the balance of creation. Yet he also knew that the gods had shaped him for Gilgamesh, and in their bond, he felt both duty and desire. Though he feared the guardian, he could not leave Gilgamesh to face the danger alone. His loyalty was stronger than his fear, and so he agreed to the journey, even as unease lingered in his heart. The people of Uruk, when they heard of their king's intention, were filled with dread. They knew Humbaba's terror. They knew the forest was not meant for mortals. They tried to dissuade Gilgamesh, urging him to be content with the greatness of Uruk, to find satisfaction in the splendor already achieved. But Gilgamesh was unmoved. The voices of caution only sharpened his determination. He declared that death comes for all, but the name of the brave endures. If he should fall in the cedar forest, at least his deeds would be remembered. And if he should triumph, Uruk would stand taller than any city upon the earth. The elders, seeing his resolve, offered their blessings, though their hearts were heavy. They counseled him to honor the gods, to take Enkidu as his guide, and to remember that even kings must bow before fate. Before their departure, Gilgamesh sought the blessing of his mother, the goddess Ninsun. She, wise and sorrowful, performed rituals and prayers, offering incense and sacrifice to the sun god Shamash, who might aid them on their perilous journey. She embraced Enkidu as a son, recognizing that he, too, was bound to this path, that his fate was now intertwined with her child's. With her blessings upon them, Gilgamesh and Enkidu prepared to set forth. The city watched as the two companions armed themselves with weapons forged for the task, great axes and swords that gleamed with the promise of battle. The gates of Uruk opened, and the two men stepped beyond, leaving behind the safety of their city, stepping into a world of danger and legend. It is here that their bond deepened most of all. As they walked together across the plains, through valleys and hills, they shared their fears, their hopes, their laughter. Gilgamesh, though brave in his words, sometimes trembled at the thought of Humbaba's might, and in those moments Enkidu steadied him, reminding him that they faced the trial together. And when Enkidu faltered, burdened by his knowledge of the guardian's terror, Gilgamesh lifted his spirits, speaking of glory, of songs yet unwritten. Their companionship was not one of perfection but of balance. Where one faltered, the other gave strength, and where one soared, the other gave grounding. In this harmony lay the true gift of the gods. The journey itself was long, and each night they built a camp beneath the stars. They lay upon the earth, speaking softly of the deeds to come, and when sleep overcame them, dreams arrived to guide their steps. Gilgamesh dreamt of mountains collapsing, of lightning flashing across the sky, of a being who stood beside him with the strength of the gods. Each time he woke, disturbed and uncertain, Enkidu interpreted the dreams, telling him they were signs of victory, that Shamash himself was on their side. These dreams, and Enkidu's steady voice, calmed the restless heart of the king, turning his fear into determination. Thus, step by step, Gilgamesh and Enkidu moved closer to the cedar forest, closer to the trial that awaited them. Behind them lay Uruk, its people anxious yet hopeful, its gods watchful. Before them lay the towering trees, the shadowed paths, and the guardian whose roar was said to shake the heavens. The stage was set, the companions prepared, their bond tested by distance and strengthened by trust. What awaited them in the forest was more than a battle. It was the crucible in which their friendship would be proven, their courage measured, and their destinies sealed. The long journey back from the cedar forest was unlike the path that had brought them there. The trees behind them whispered with the memory of what had been done, their branches creaking as though lamenting the loss of their guardian. But before Gilgamesh and Enkidu stretched open land once more, and with each step toward Uruk, the burden of the forest seemed lighter. Gilgamesh carried himself with the air of triumph, his shoulders broad, his eyes shining with the conviction that his name would never be forgotten. He had done what no king before him had dared, had faced the terror of Humbaba and brought it low. By his side walked Enkidu, strong and loyal as ever, though quieter, more watchful. For in his heart, a shadow lingered, and though he celebrated their victory, he knew that the gods were not easily defied, nor was the balance of the wild so easily disturbed. When at last the walls of Uruk came into sight, the city rose like a vision from the plain, its gates tall, its streets already stirring with the hum of rumor. Word of the hero's approach had reached the people, carried on the lips of travelers, magnified by anticipation. Men and women poured into the streets to greet their king, to behold the figure of Gilgamesh returning not as a mere man, but as one who had faced down terror and returned crowned with glory. They cheered, their voices rising like a tide, and they pressed forward to see the cedar beams, to marvel at the spoils of the sacred forest. Songs began to stir, verses already weaving the tale into something larger than life. For Uruk had always loved stories, and now it had one worthy of its walls. In the center of the city, Gilgamesh stood tall, and Enkidu stood beside him, and the people showered them with praise. Garlands were offered, music was played, and the air trembled with the joy of victory. For a time, even Enkidu felt his doubts quiet, soothed by the warmth of the people's gratitude. Yet even as the celebration swelled, a gaze from above was fixed upon them, a gaze that belonged not to mortal men or women, but to a goddess whose eyes had lingered long upon the beauty of Gilgamesh. Ishtar, daughter of Anu, goddess of love and of war, of desire and destruction, beheld the king of Uruk as he stood triumphant. His strength was radiant, his body gleamed with the vigor of youth, and his name already carried the luster of legend. Desire stirred in her heart, for Ishtar was ever restless, ever drawn to beauty and might. She descended in thought toward the city, clothed in brilliance, her intentions clear. The goddess would have Gilgamesh for herself, would claim him as her consort, would bind his fate to hers in both passion and power. Before the people of Uruk, she approached him, her beauty dazzling, her words sweetened with promise. She offered him kingship beyond imagining, riches untold, a yoke of love that would lift him above all men. She spoke of chariots of gold and lapis, of divine favor that would never wane, of dominion not only over men but over the creatures of the earth and sky. She promised him a union that would make him more than mortal, that would bring him glory unending. The people watched in awe, for to be chosen by a goddess was no small honor. To many, it would have seemed the height of fortune, a gift beyond measure. Yet Gilgamesh, in his pride and in his awareness of Ishtar's ways, did not bend. He knew her nature, knew the tales of her lovers, and knew too well the ruin that followed those who yielded to her. He spoke not with reverence, but with scorn, listing before all the fates of those whom Ishtar had once loved and cast aside. He named the shepherd who was turned into a wolf, the stallion broken and hobbled, the young man struck down by fate. Each story was a wound laid bare, a reminder that her love was fleeting, her wrath enduring. His refusal cut through the air like a blade. The people gasped, for to reject a goddess was a daring thing, even for a king. Ishtar's face darkened, her beauty clouded with rage, her pride wounded more deeply than any mortal wound could cut. In that moment, the joy of Uruk trembled, for though Gilgamesh stood fearless, the people knew the anger of a goddess was no small thing. She turned from him in fury, her steps shaking the air, her voice already calling for vengeance. She ascended once more to the heavens, her heart burning with wrath. To her father Anu she went, demanding justice, demanding that Gilgamesh be punished for his arrogance, for his insult to her divinity. She spoke with fire, declaring that she would not rest until Uruk was struck, until its king learned the cost of spurning her. Anu hesitated, for even among the gods, Ishtar's fury was feared, but she pressed him with threats, declaring that she would shatter the gates of the underworld, release the dead to devour the living, unleash chaos upon creation itself if her demand were not met. At last, Anu yielded. To appease his daughter's fury, he loosed upon the earth the bull of heaven, a creature of destruction, vast and relentless, whose very breath brought famine, whose hooves cracked the earth, whose hunger devoured men and fields alike. Ishtar, triumphant in her wrath, guided the bull toward Uruk, determined that Gilgamesh and all his people would pay for his defiance. Back in the city, the joy of celebration was cut short. From the horizon came a trembling, a sound that shook the stones of the walls, a dust that rose like a storm. The bowl of heaven was coming, and its shadow fell across Uruk like nightfall. The people cried out in fear, their songs silenced, their hands trembling as they looked to their king. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, hearing the cries, stood together once more, their faces hardened, their hearts bound in resolve. For though the challenge was divine, though the wrath of heaven had descended, they would not turn away. The story was not finished, nor would it be told in whispers. The bonds of the companions would be tested once again, and the gods themselves would watch. The ground shook beneath Uruk as the bowl of heaven descended, its hooves tearing into the soil with a force that split the earth. Each step it took opened cracks that spread like wounds across the land, and from those fissures came a stench of famine and ruin. Crops withered in an instant, rivers seemed to retreat, and the sky itself grew darker as though recoiling from the beast's presence. The people of Uruk, who had so recently sung of victory, now cried out in terror. Their voices rose in a chorus of fear, echoing through the walls and spilling into the streets, for never had they seen such a force unleashed. The bull was vast, its body immense, its eyes burning with the fire of divine rage, its breath steaming like smoke from a furnace. At the head of the panicked crowd stood Ishtar, her fury unquenched, her pride burning brighter than ever. She called out to the people, declaring that Gilgamesh had brought this upon them, that his arrogance had offended the gods, that his rejection of her love had summoned this punishment. She stood upon the walls of Uruk, exulting as the beast charged, demanding that Gilgamesh be crushed beneath its hooves, that all might see the cost of spurning a goddess. Her voice carried far, but even above it, the roar of the bull resounded, shaking stones loose from the walls and making the earth itself tremble. In the heart of the city, Gilgamesh did not flinch. He had faced Humbaba, had entered the depths of the cedar forest, had stood against terrors men could scarcely imagine. Now, once again, his courage was called upon, for Uruk was his city, and its people looked to him. Beside him stood Enkidu, loyal and unyielding, his eyes fierce with determination. The wildness in him recognized the divine beast, knew the scale of the challenge before them, yet no trace of hesitation marked his stance. Together they stood, warriors bound not only by friendship, but by a fate that had carried them this far and would carry them further still. The bowl of heaven struck first. With a great snort, it lowered its head and charged, its horns glinting like sharpened blades, its hooves pounding the earth so hard that hundreds fell where they stood, shaken to the ground. The creature's breath blasted across the plain, and men dropped in its wake, lifeless, their strength stolen by the power of the gods. The streets shook as the beast drove itself toward the city, smashing walls and toppling gates. The people wailed, seeking safety, yet there was no safety from such wrath. Only Gilgamesh and Enkidu could hope to stand in its path. Gilgamesh raised his voice, calling upon Shamash, the sun god who had aided him before. He prayed for strength, for light in the darkness, for a hand to steady his own. The sun pierced briefly through the dark clouds above, a shaft of brightness falling upon the two companions, and in that glow, Gilgamesh lifted his axe and his blade. Enkidu, with the strength of the wild coursing through him, rushed alongside, his hands unafraid, his cries fierce. They faced the bull as men might face a mountain, yet neither turned aside. The clash was terrible. The bull's horns swept with deadly force, striking stone and sending fragments flying. Its breath scorched the ground, leaving patches of blackened soil. Gilgamesh darted in close, striking at its flanks with steel, while Enkidu sought to distract and restrain, his hands reaching for the horns, his body straining with every ounce of power he possessed. Again and again, they attacked, their movements fueled not only by strength but by unity, for each trusted the other completely. When Gilgamesh faltered, Enkidu was there. When Enkidu stumbled, Gilgamesh held firm. Together, they wove their courage into something greater than the sum of their parts. Still, the bull was no ordinary foe. Each strike it delivered sent tremors through the earth. With one great snort, it opened its jaws and consumed scores of men, pulling them into the abyss created by its divine hunger. The people of Uruk despaired, seeing the devastation, but their cries only strengthened the resolve of their king and his companion. For they knew this battle was not only for themselves, but for every life within the city walls. At last, the tide began to shift. Enkidu, summoning all his strength, seized the horns of the bull, gripping them as the beast thrashed and roared. He held on with a force born of desperation and loyalty, his feet gouging into the ground, his body straining against the might of heaven itself. He cried out to Gilgamesh, urging him to strike, to deliver the blow that would bring the monster down. Gilgamesh did not hesitate. With axe raised high, he leapt forward, his body guided by the light of Shamash, his will sharpened by the bond with his companion. He struck deep into the neck of the bull, the blade biting through flesh and sinew, sinking into the heart of the beast. The bull of heaven staggered, its roar splitting the sky, its legs trembling beneath its massive weight. One final time, it shook the earth, then collapsed, the force of its fall echoing like thunder across the plain. Dust rose in a great cloud, and silence followed, broken only by the ragged breaths of the two companions standing victorious. The people of Uruk, stunned and trembling, slowly lifted their eyes, disbelief mingling with awe. Their king had slain the terror sent from heaven itself. Ishtar, standing upon the walls, shrieked with rage. She tore at her jewels, her voice carrying curses upon the wind. She cried that Gilgamesh would pay, that Enkidu would suffer, that the gods would not forgive such defiance. Her fury filled the air, yet the people mocked her, emboldened by the sight of their king and his companion triumphant. They hurled insults and laughter, scorning the goddess who had failed to bring about their ruin. Her humiliation was complete, her vengeance unsated, and her wrath turned toward the heavens once more. Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood over the fallen bull, their weapons lowered, their hearts pounding. The beast lay still, its body vast as a hill, its eyes dimmed, its power extinguished. They had triumphed where no men should have triumphed, had stood against a force of divine wrath, and endured. Gilgamesh exulted, his pride swelling, for his glory now seemed beyond compare. He had slain Humbaba, and now he had slain the bull of heaven. His name, he believed, would echo forever. Yet for Enkidu, the victory carried a shadow. He sensed that the gods would not remain silent, that their triumph would carry a price. Though he laughed with his friend and shared in the joy of the people, deep within him stirred a heaviness he could not name. That night, the city celebrated, though its streets still bore the scars of battle. Songs were sung of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, of their courage, of their unbreakable bond. Fires burned, music filled the air, and the people forgot their fear in the warmth of victory. But above them, in the halls of the gods, a council was forming. For the slaying of the bull had shaken more than the earth. It had shaken the order of heaven. The gods had watched, and the gods would decide. In the quiet that followed the battle, The city of Uruk glowed with firelight. Songs drifted into the night, voices raised in praise of the heroes who had once again delivered their people from ruin. Gilgamesh stood at the center of it all, radiant with triumph, his laughter loud and his confidence unshaken. Beside him sat Enkidu, sharing in the joy yet carrying a stillness that seemed heavier than before. He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. His hand rested upon his knee, his shoulders bent ever so slightly, as though the weight of the unseen pressed upon him. The people could not see it, nor did Gilgamesh notice in his pride, but Enkidu felt the shadow even as the feast continued long into the night. Far above, in the heavens where mortals could not gaze, the gods gathered in solemn council. The bowl of heaven lay slain upon the earth, its spirit carried back into the realm of the divine, and Humbaba too was gone, cut down in the sacred forest. The gods beheld these deeds not as men beheld them, not with awe or with pride, but with anger. For Gilgamesh and Enkidu had crossed the boundary that divided mortals from the divine. They had slain guardians placed by the gods themselves. They had stood against heaven's power and dared to win. Anu, the father of the gods, sat at the head of the council, his voice heavy with the weight of judgment. Shamash, the sun god, looked upon the heroes with favor, for he had aided them and seen their courage. Yet even his defense could not silence the anger of Ishtar, who raged with humiliation, her pride wounded beyond healing. She demanded punishment, demanded that the heroes pay for their insolence, demanded that the order of heaven be restored by striking down the companions. Her cries filled the assembly, her fury burning hotter than flame. The gods debated, their voices rolling like distant thunder, each weighing what must be done. To leave the deeds unpunished would be to invite every mortal to challenge the gods. To strike Gilgamesh might seem just, yet he was part divine, and his destiny was not so easily severed. In the end, the council turned its gaze upon Enkidu, the man shaped from clay and wilderness, the companion brought forth to temper Gilgamesh's pride. If one must fall, it would be him. His fate was sealed not by his own choice, but by the decree of the gods. He would die, and his death would teach both Gilgamesh and all humankind the limits that no man might cross without cost. That night, as the people of Uruk slept, Enkidu dreamed. In his vision, the sky darkened, and the heavens opened before him. He saw the gods seated in their council, their eyes fixed upon him with judgment. He saw Anu, he saw Shamash, he saw Ishtar's burning rage, and he heard the sentence pronounced. His body grew heavy, his limbs weakened, and he understood that his time upon the earth would not be long. He dreamed further, of the underworld, of a place where the dead dwelt in darkness, clothed in feathers, feeding on dust. He saw the gates of that land, guarded and unyielding, and he felt himself being drawn toward them. He woke with a cry, his body trembling, his skin damp with sweat. Gilgamesh stirred beside him, asking what vision had come, what omen troubled his heart. And Enkidu spoke, his voice heavy with dread, recounting all he had seen. He told his friend that the gods had decreed his death, that the bond they had shared, the victories they had won, had come at too high a cost. Gilgamesh listened in disbelief, his laughter faltering, his pride struck by fear. He tried to comfort Enkidu, to insist that the dream was but a shadow, that the gods would not take what they themselves had given. But Enkidu knew better. He felt it in his bones, in the heaviness that lingered in his chest, in the weariness that no sleep could shake. The days that followed did not ease his dread. Illness crept upon him like a thief, slow at first, then stronger, until his steps grew heavy and his limbs unsteady. Where once he had matched Gilgamesh stride for stride, now he lagged behind, his strength fading. The city noticed, whispers spreading that the great companion of the king was faltering. Gilgamesh refused to see it, refused to admit that the gods could take his brother in arms. He prayed to Shamash, lifting his voice to the heavens, begging for mercy, pleading for Enkidu's life. He offered sacrifices, he laid gifts at the temples. He humbled himself before every god who might listen. Yet the decree had been spoken, and no offering could undo it. Enkidu's mind turned often to bitterness. He cursed the trapper who had first spotted him in the wild, cursed the harlot who had lured him into the city, cursed the very day he had left the freedom of the wilderness to be bound to Gilgamesh's fate. He lamented the deeds they had done together, the slaying of Humbaba, the killing of the bull, the choices that had drawn heaven's wrath upon him. Yet even in his bitterness, there were moments of tenderness. For he would look upon Gilgamesh and see not only a king but the friend who had stood beside him in every trial, the brother his heart had chosen. In time, he found peace in the thought that he had lived fully, that he had loved and been loved, that his name would be remembered not as a shadow, but as one who had walked beside a king and made him more than he could ever have been alone. His body weakened, but his spirit did not waver in those final moments. He looked upon Gilgamesh, who wept beside him, and he spoke softly, reminding him of their bond, of the adventures they had shared, of the joy they had known even amidst the trials. He urged him to remember, not with sorrow, but with honor. And so, as the gods had decreed, Enkidu's life began to fade. The strength left his limbs, the fire dimmed in his eyes, and the wild man who had once run with the beasts returned to the silence from which he had been shaped. Gilgamesh held him, his tears unceasing, his cries echoing through the chambers, for never had he known such grief. The city mourned with him, but no one mourned more deeply than the king who had found in Enkidu a companion beyond compare. In the heavens, the gods sat silent. Their decree had been fulfilled. The balance had been restored. But upon the earth, a man's heart had been broken, and from that wound would come a journey unlike any before. For Gilgamesh, the story was far from over. The tale continues with a somber air, for now the joy that once defined the companionship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu begins to fade. Where once there had been laughter, shared strength, and a sense of immortality in their friendship, now there arrives the shadow of mortality, pressing its weight upon the heart of the wild man who had come to know the warmth of civilization. Enkidu, the mighty equal of Gilgamesh, the companion of battles and guardian of his king, is struck down not by sword or beast, but by the unseen hand of the divine decree. It begins quietly, with dreams and omens that disturb his sleep. They are not the dreams of victory or of hunting in the open plain. Instead, he sees images of the underworld, a house of dust where those who were once mighty now sit in silence. He wakes with unease, sharing the visions with Gilgamesh, but even the great king, who faced Humbaba without flinching, cannot find the words to dispel his friend's dread. As the days unfold, Enkidu falls ill. His body weakens, and the vigor that once defined him, the strength that came from both wilderness and friendship, begins to wane. He lies upon a bed, restless, his spirit troubled. He curses the very paths that led him from the wild into the company of men. He recalls the hunter who first found him at the watering hole, and the woman Shamhat who tamed him with bread, wine, and tenderness. In his anguish, he blames them, for it was through them that he was drawn into the destiny now awaiting him. He curses the hunter, wishing he had never encountered him. He curses the woman, saying she lured him into a fate of pain, when once he had been free under the stars. His words are filled with bitterness, for in his suffering he cannot see the greater story he became part of. But then a voice answers him, a divine presence reminding him that without Shamhat's gentle hand he would never have known Gilgamesh, never tasted companionship, nor lived deeds that would be sung for eternity. Slowly, Enkidu retracts his curses, replacing them with blessings. He blesses Shamhat for introducing him to bread, to wine, to clothing, and to the bond of brotherhood that made him more than beast. He blesses her for guiding him toward a destiny that, though short, shone brightly enough to be remembered forever. Yet the blessing does not ease the hand of death. His illness lingers for 12 days, each day marked by growing weakness. Gilgamesh, who once roared against Humbaba and defied the bull of heaven, now watches helplessly. For the first time, the king feels powerless, unable to shield his friend from the fate decreed by gods. He sits beside him, speaking words of comfort, recalling the victories they shared, yet his voice cracks, for deep within he knows the end approaches. On the final day, Enkidu speaks of the dreams he has seen. He describes the great house of dust, where all kings, priests, and warriors eventually go, their crowns discarded, their splendor reduced to silence. He speaks of a place where even those who once ruled are servants, and where the great are indistinguishable from the humble. His voice trembles with sorrow, for he knows he is soon to enter that place. And then, when the last strength leaves him, Enkidu, the beloved companion, the wild man who became brother to Gilgamesh, breathes his final breath. The silence that follows is heavy, and it crushes Gilgamesh. The mighty king, who thought himself above weakness, now confronts grief more powerful than any foe he had battled. He weeps. He mourns with cries that echo through Uruk. He covers his friend's body. He touches his chest. He calls his name, unwilling to believe he is gone. The stillness of Enkidu's face is unbearable, and Gilgamesh's sorrow turns to despair. For the first time, the great king is confronted not just with the loss of his companion, but with the realization of his own mortality. If Enkidu, as strong as a wild ox, could fall, then so too must he. The truth strikes him like no blade ever could. Death, the one enemy no man can conquer, now stands revealed before him. The funeral of Enkidu is described with grandeur, for Gilgamesh refuses to let his friend pass unnoticed. He commands artisans and priests to prepare a great resting place. He orders the statues to be carved, offerings to be made, treasures to be buried alongside him. Musicians play, mourners cry aloud, the city laments. For 7 days and 7 nights, Gilgamesh refuses to leave his side. He guards the body, unwilling to accept corruption, unwilling to release him to the earth. His grief becomes an obsession, and it changes him. He who once sought only glory in the eyes of men now seeks to escape the fate that claimed his brother. He sees not just the loss of his friend, but the reflection of his own end, and it terrifies him. It is in this sorrow, in this unbearable awareness of death, that the next chapter of Gilgamesh's life begins. No longer is he the king who only sought conquest and renown. Now he becomes the seeker, the wanderer, driven by fear and longing. He will search for something no man has ever found, the secret of eternal life. For Enkidu's passing has awakened in him a dread so deep that he cannot remain still within the walls of Uruk. His mourning, his tears, and his restless heart will carry him into deserts, mountains, and across great waters, in search of wisdom beyond the reach of ordinary men. But for now, in this moment of sorrow, the king sits in silence, watching the still form of his beloved friend, and the world itself seems to pause in reverence for the bond that had burned so brightly, even if only for a fleeting span of time. The death of Enkidu lingers in the air like a shadow that refuses to lift, and Gilgamesh, unable to accept what has happened, begins to wander in a haze of grief and despair. He leaves behind the ordered world of Uruk, its walls, its temples, its people, and enters a restless state of being where nothing seems to matter but the pursuit of an answer to death. He cannot bear to sit upon his throne, for its weight feels hollow without his companion at his side. He cannot drink the wine, nor hear the songs of the court, for every sound reminds him of laughter that will never return. His days are filled with lament, and his nights with tears. Sleep, once a natural comfort, now flees from him, for in every quiet hour he sees the face of Enkidu and the fate that awaits all men. The king who had once sought only fame and heroic deeds now feels the sting of futility. What use is glory, he asks himself, if even the strongest must crumble to dust? What use is power, if it cannot shield against the silence of the grave? Driven by this torment, Gilgamesh resolves to do what no man has done before. He will search for immortality itself. If the gods have taken Enkidu, then perhaps there remains some hidden wisdom, some forgotten secret that can spare him from the same fate. His heart clings to a single hope, fragile but burning with intensity. He recalls stories whispered in ancient times of a man who once survived the great flood, who was granted everlasting life by the gods themselves. This man, Utnapishtim, is said to live at the edge of the world, beyond the waters no mortal dares cross, beyond mountains no traveler returns from. To him, Gilgamesh must go. For if such a secret exists, if such a truth lies hidden in the farthest reaches of creation, Gilgamesh will find it, even if he must wander until his body breaks. So he leaves Uruk, abandoning his crown, his responsibilities, and the comforts of civilization. He sets out across barren lands, clad not in royal robes, but in the skins of animals, a figure wild and haunted. He wanders into deserts where the sun burns mercilessly, drinking little, eating less, sustained only by determination. His hair grows unkempt, his body lean and hardened by suffering, and still he presses forward. The journey becomes a reflection of his grief, each step an act of defiance against the finality of death. He travels through wastelands where jackals cry at night, and the wind howls with emptiness, places no king is meant to tread. Yet he walks them with single-minded purpose, seeking the path that will lead him to Utnapishtim. As he wanders, Gilgamesh encounters men and women who look upon him with awe, for though weary and broken, he still carries the stature of a king. Some recognize him, others see only a stranger, but all sense the weight he bears. They ask why he roams so far from Uruk, and he answers with the same lament. He has lost his beloved friend, and in that loss he has discovered the terror of death. He cannot rest, he cannot accept, and so he seeks the one man whom the gods granted eternal life. His voice is heavy, and his eyes seem fixed on something distant, a horizon beyond human sight. In his journey, he comes to understand what it is to be human in a way he never had within his city walls. For in the wilderness he is not king, but a man stripped bare before the forces of time and destiny. One night, under the vast dome of stars, Gilgamesh cries aloud to the heavens. He demands to know why men must die, why love must end, why even the greatest heroes cannot escape the grave. His words are carried into the darkness, unanswered. The silence of the universe offers him no comfort, yet still he clings to his quest, for to give up now would be to surrender not only Enkidu's memory, but his own hope. The stars remind him of the fragility of human life, a fleeting spark against the endless sky, and yet they also remind him of the possibility of eternity. Somewhere, he believes, lies the key. Days turn to weeks, weeks to months, and still Gilgamesh presses forward. He endures storms, hunger, exhaustion, and loneliness, his heart refusing to relent. Each hardship only deepens his resolve, for every moment of suffering reminds him of Enkidu's final days, and he swears to himself he will not rest until he has found the secret of everlasting life. His journey takes him to distant mountains, to valleys carved by ancient rivers, to lands where no familiar voice can reach him. He becomes something of a ghost upon the earth, a man walking between life and death, between hope and despair. At times, he feels his strength falter. At times, he doubts whether he will ever find Utnapishtim. Yet each time despair threatens to consume him, he remembers the face of Enkidu, his laughter, his loyalty, the brotherhood they shared. That memory becomes his compass, guiding him when all else seems lost. He knows he cannot bring his friend back, but perhaps he can preserve himself, carrying that memory into eternity. It is not only his own life he seeks to preserve, but the bond that gave it meaning. Thus Gilgamesh, once king of Uruk, now wanderer upon the edges of the world, begins the great quest that will define the rest of his tale. No longer is he only the hero who defeated monsters or the ruler who built mighty walls. He is now the seeker of truths hidden from mankind, the man who dares to confront death itself. His path is uncertain, his goal nearly impossible, yet the weight of grief leaves him no choice but to continue. And so he walks on, a lonely figure under the vast sky, his footsteps carrying him ever closer to the mysteries that lie at the edge of the known world. The journey of Gilgamesh carries him further from all that he once knew, and soon he finds himself upon the road that leads to the twin mountains called Mashu, where the sun itself is said to rise and set. These mountains, guardians of the horizon, are described as vast and immovable, their peaks reaching into the heavens, their bases sinking into the underworld. To pass them is to step into a threshold between life and death, between the world of men and the realm of the divine. At their gates stand two fearsome scorpion beings, creatures neither wholly of this earth nor entirely of the heavens. Their bodies gleam with armor, their stings carry the threat of sudden death, and their gaze alone is said to strike terror into the hearts of mortals. They guard the path where the sun passes each day, watching without rest, for no mortal may walk this way unless permitted by fate. When Gilgamesh approaches, weary from his wanderings yet burning with determination, the scorpion beings take notice. They see a man covered in skins, his face drawn with grief, his eyes hollow from endless travel. Yet they also see something more, the light of divinity mixed into his form, for though Gilgamesh is mortal, he is two-thirds God, and his stature is unlike any other who has come before. One of the scorpion guards looks upon him with astonishment, remarking to his companion that never has such a one approached these gates. They sense his strength, but they also sense his despair. They question him, asking what madness drives a man to come so far, to seek passage through the road of the sun, a road no mortal survives. Gilgamesh, with trembling voice but unshaken purpose, explains that he grieves for Enkidu, his beloved companion, and that he cannot accept the fate of death. He speaks of his journey to seek Utnapishtim, the one who was granted eternal life, for he must know how to escape the doom that has claimed all before him. The words of Gilgamesh move the scorpion beings, for they recognize both his mortal fragility and his divine essence. The male scorpion warns him sternly of the dangers ahead. The path through the mountains is a tunnel of darkness, stretching for 12 leagues, where no light shines, no water flows, no food may be found. It is the very path the sun itself travels each night, unseen by men. To walk it is to risk being swallowed by the eternal night, and no mortal has ever emerged alive. Yet when the female scorpion sees the grief upon Gilgamesh's face, she speaks with compassion. She tells her mate that his suffering is genuine, that his quest is born not of arrogance, but of love and fear. She urges him to allow Gilgamesh to try, for the fate of this man is unusual, and perhaps his path has indeed been chosen by powers greater than they. After a moment of silence, the male scorpion agrees. He warns Gilgamesh once more, telling him that the road will test his strength beyond measure and that he must not falter. But he opens the gate of the mountains, granting passage where few, if any, have been permitted before. Gilgamesh bows in gratitude, his heart beating with both fear and determination. He knows the journey ahead may claim his life, yet he feels there is no choice. To turn back would mean surrendering to despair, to return to Uruk empty-handed, to accept the same in that befell Enkidu. And so, with a final glance at the scorpion beings, he steps forward into the tunnel. Inside, the darkness closes around him. For the first league, Gilgamesh presses forward, his hands stretched before him, unable to see even his own form. The air is thick, heavy, and silent, save for the sound of his footsteps. The second league feels heavier still, the blackness suffocating, as though he walks not upon earth, but within the belly of some vast creature. At the third and fourth leagues, he begins to stumble, for his sense of direction falters, and he cannot tell how far he has come or how much remains. Yet he does not turn back. His grief propels him. His longing for answers pushes him forward. By the halfway point, exhaustion grips him. He has walked for 6 leagues in total darkness, and he feels his body strain. Yet in the 7th league, a faint glow appears ahead, like a distant promise. It is not yet the full light of day, but it is enough to remind him that the end may be near. With renewed strength, he presses on, though each step feels heavier than the last. The 8th and 9th leagues are filled with strange sensations, as though voices whisper around him, as though unseen hands brush against his skin. He shudders, but does not stop. In the 10th league, the air grows lighter, the darkness thinning. By the 11th league, his heart races, for he senses the end is near. And at last, in the 12th league, light bursts forth around him, and Gilgamesh emerges from the tunnel. Before him lies a landscape unlike any he has ever seen. A garden stretches out, filled not with ordinary trees, but with ones that bear jewels for fruit. The branches sparkle with precious stones. Lapis lazuli glows with deep blue, carnelian gleams red, and pearls glimmer like drops of moonlight. The ground itself seems to shimmer, and the air carries a stillness that speaks of timelessness. Gilgamesh, weary and battered, pauses in awe. He has crossed the road of the sun, passed through the realm of night, and now stands in a place that seems closer to the divine than to the mortal world. It is here, in this garden of dazzling wonders, that his next trials will begin, for though he has survived the path of darkness, his journey to uncover the secret of eternal life has only just entered its most mysterious phase. When Gilgamesh steps into the jeweled garden, he finds himself in a place that feels suspended outside of ordinary time. The trees bear fruits of carnelian, emerald, and jasper, their branches glittering like the heavens. The path beneath his feet is smooth and shining, as though worn not by mortals, but by the passage of divine presence. For a moment, the weary king allows himself to marvel, his heart struck with wonder, yet even here, surrounded by brilliance, he does not forget the purpose that drives him. The jewels may glitter, but they cannot soothe the ache of mortality, nor do they silence the voice of grief that whispers Enkidu's name. His steps continue, steady, restless, leading him deeper into the garden until he reaches a dwelling unlike any he has seen, where the innkeeper of the gods resides. This woman is Siduri, the tavern keeper, who dwells at the edge of the world, serving drink to the gods and watching over those rare wanderers who reach her domain. Siduri notices the figure who approaches. His clothes are torn, his body gaunt, his face wild with grief and determination. At first she does not recognize him as a king, for he appears more like a desperate wanderer than a ruler of men. She feels fear stir in her heart, for no mortal comes this far without reason, and such reason often carries danger. She retreats into her dwelling, bolting the door, hoping to keep this stranger at bay. But Gilgamesh, seeing the door barred against him, calls out with a voice cracked by weariness yet still filled with the authority of one born to command. He tells her his name. He declares that he is Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, the builder of great walls, the slayer of Humbaba, the one who defeated the bull of heaven. His words carry weight, though his appearance suggests a man broken by suffering. He begs her not to turn him away, for he has come seeking Utnapishtim, the one who holds the secret of eternal life. Siduri, listening from within, is moved by his voice but still fears his desperation. At last, she opens a small gap in the door and speaks to him. She tells him that all men must die, that death is woven into the fabric of life itself, and that to seek to escape it is to chase an illusion. She reminds him of the joys that mortals are given: to eat, to drink, to clothe oneself in fine garments, to dance, to love, to raise children, to live each day fully while it is granted. These things, she says, are the true gifts to mankind, and they are not diminished by death, but rather made precious by it. She urges him to abandon his hopeless quest, to return to Uruk, to rule wisely, and to cherish the time he has rather than squander it chasing the impossible. But Gilgamesh, though touched by her words, cannot accept them. He listens, yet the pain in his heart resists her counsel. How can he, who has held Enkidu in his arms as life left him, accept such a fate for himself? How can he, who has conquered the fiercest foes, bow before the silent hand of death? He replies to Siduri with urgency, saying that he cannot turn back, that he cannot rest, not until he has looked upon Utnapishtim and asked him face to face how he escaped the fate of men. He tells her of his grief, of his fear, of his sleepless nights, and in his words there is a truth so raw that even Siduri, wise though she is, feels compassion stir. She sees that this is not mere pride but a soul in anguish, seeking hope where none may exist. At last, Siduri steps fully from her dwelling and speaks again. She admits that she cannot give him the secret he seeks, for it lies far beyond her power. But she tells him the way to Utnapishtim, though the path is perilous. She speaks of Urshanabi, the ferryman of Utnapishtim, who dwells by the waters of death. Only through him may Gilgamesh hope to reach the immortal one, for the waters are impassable by any ordinary means. She warns Gilgamesh that the journey is long, that even should he find the ferryman, many trials still await. Yet she does not bar his path. Instead, she points him onward, toward the distant shores where Urshanabi keeps his boat. Gilgamesh bows his head in gratitude, for though Siduri has not given him what he most desires, she has offered direction, and that is enough to renew his steps. He leaves the jeweled garden behind, walking once more into the unknown, his heart heavy yet aflame with determination. Siduri watches him go, her heart troubled. She knows that the wisdom she offered was the truest comfort he might ever receive, yet she also knows that his spirit will not rest until he has pursued the path to its very end. And so she lets him pass, whispering a quiet prayer to the gods that he may find either the answer he seeks or the peace he needs. As Gilgamesh continues onward, the words of Siduri echo within him. He cannot dismiss them, for they hold a wisdom he cannot deny. Part of him wonders if perhaps she is right, if perhaps the fleeting joys of life are the true measure of existence. Yet his grief and fear drive him past such thoughts, pushing him toward the ferryman and the mysteries that lie beyond the waters of death. He is a man caught between two truths, the human acceptance of mortality and the divine yearning for eternity. And so he walks, his shadow stretching long upon the path, as the jeweled garden fades behind him and the endless horizon opens before his weary yet unyielding stride. Gilgamesh follows the path described by Siduri, his steps carrying him away from the jeweled trees and into a harsher, lonelier landscape. The colors of the garden fade behind him, replaced once more by barren earth, scattered stones, and the endless sweep of wilderness. His heart feels heavy, for though Siduri had offered him kindness and wisdom, her words could not quiet the storm within him. They echo in his thoughts nonetheless. Her counsel to embrace the mortal joys of life, to accept death as the measure that gives meaning to existence. Yet grief is a relentless companion, and fear drives him on. He cannot rest while Enkidu lies silent in the grave, and he cannot bear the thought of joining him there. His only hope lies in reaching Utnapishtim, the man who endured the flood and gained life everlasting. Toward this hope, Gilgamesh continues. At last, after long wandering, he comes upon the place Siduri spoke of. There, by the shore of waters unlike any he has seen, he finds the ferryman, Urshanabi. The waters themselves seem uncanny, vast and still, stretching into a horizon that offers no familiar comfort. They are known as the waters of death, and no mortal hand may touch them, for even the lightest contact would bring destruction. The boat of Urshanabi rests at the edge, silent as though waiting. The ferryman himself is unlike the men of Uruk. His appearance is marked by the stillness of one who serves an eternal task, his eyes deep with the weight of secrets, his presence calm yet wary. When he sees Gilgamesh approach, clothed in animal skins, gaunt from travel, his face drawn with grief, he does not recognize a king, but a man worn thin by suffering. Gilgamesh calls out to him, declaring his name, recounting his deeds, and naming the purpose of his quest. He speaks of Enkidu, of death, of his longing to escape the same fate, and of Utnapishtim, the one man who holds the answer. He pleads with Urshanabi to take him across the waters, to guide him to the immortal one. But the ferryman does not agree so quickly. He regards Gilgamesh in silence, as though weighing the truth of his words. He questions him, asking why he thinks he may deserve to cross, asking what he hopes to find. Gilgamesh answers with the only truth he knows, that he cannot rest, that he cannot accept the fate of all men, that his heart will never be at peace until he has spoken to Utnapishtim himself. Urshanabi listens, but when he inspects the boat, he discovers that the sacred tackle and stones needed for the journey have been destroyed. In his grief and rage, Gilgamesh himself has shattered them, striking out at the unfamiliar things in his path. Without them, the crossing cannot be made in the ordinary way, for the waters will consume any who touch them. At first, the ferryman despairs, telling Gilgamesh that he has ruined his only chance. But Gilgamesh, driven by determination, refuses to yield. He begs Urshanabi for another way, swearing that he will do whatever is required. At last, the ferryman gives him a task. He instructs him to cut great poles from the forest nearby, long and sturdy, each one smoothed and stripped, so that they may push the boat forward without touching the waters themselves. Gilgamesh obeys without hesitation. He enters the forest, fells the trees, and shapes the poles with his own hands. He works tirelessly, though his body is weary from months of wandering. When at last the poles are ready, he carries them to Urshanabi, who prepares the boat. Together they set out upon the waters of death, Gilgamesh gripping the first pole. With each push, they move farther across the still, deadly surface. One by one, the poles are used, each discarded after its strength is spent, until only a few remain. The journey is long, the horizon unchanging, the silence of the waters heavy upon them. Gilgamesh feels the weight of dread, For if the poles run out before they reach the far shore, their journey will end in ruin. Yet he does not falter. His arms ache, his body trembles, but he presses forward, one pole after another, until at last they near the end. With the final pole, the far shore comes into sight, and Gilgamesh's heart surges with hope. When they arrive, Urshanabi guides him onto land and gestures toward the place where Utnapishtim dwells. He tells Gilgamesh that this is as far as he may go, that beyond this point the king must face the immortal one alone. Gilgamesh thanks him, though his gratitude is weighted with the knowledge of what lies ahead. He steps upon the shore, his feet sinking into the unfamiliar earth, and looks toward the dwelling that awaits him. Here, at the edge of the world, beyond the waters of death, he will at last find Utnapishtim, the man who holds the knowledge he has sought with such desperation. But before Gilgamesh departs, Urshanabi offers him a quiet warning. He tells him that what he finds may not be what he expects, that wisdom often comes not as a gift, but as a burden. Gilgamesh listens, though he does not yet understand. His heart is fixed only upon the hope that he may escape the fate of Enkidu, that he may rise above the destiny of all men. With these thoughts burning within him, he sets his eyes upon the path ahead. The waves lap silently behind him, the ferryman's gaze follows, and the weary king takes his first steps toward the figure whose life and story may forever change his own. Gilgamesh walks onward from the shore, the sound of the ferryman's boat fading behind him, until silence alone accompanies his steps. The place where Utnapishtim dwells is unlike any corner of the world Gilgamesh has known. The air is heavy yet strangely still, carrying no birdsong, no whisper of the wind. The ground beneath his feet feels worn and ancient, as though countless years have pressed their weight into it. Ahead, a small dwelling stands, unremarkable in shape, yet radiant in meaning, for within it resides the one man who has crossed the boundary of mortality. Gilgamesh slows as he approaches, his heart beating with both anticipation and unease. He, who has faced lions, wrestled with beasts, and defied the wrath of gods, now feels a trembling in his chest, for he is about to confront the mystery that has haunted his every step. At the threshold of the dwelling, he sees Utnapishtim. Unlike Gilgamesh, who wears the marks of labor, grief, and restless wandering, Utnapishtim sits in quiet composure. His face is lined not with the fleeting wear of age, but with the stillness of one who has endured beyond time. His eyes hold the weight of ancient storms, and his body carries the calm of one who no longer fears death. Gilgamesh gazes at him with awe, for before him is no towering figure, no god in radiant form, but an ordinary man, resting in simplicity. Yet it is this ordinariness that unsettles him most. How can the man who survived the flood, the man who won life everlasting, appear so much like any other? Gilgamesh speaks, his voice heavy with all the months of sorrow, all the days of unending travel, and all the grief that has driven him forward. He tells Utnapishtim of Enkidu, of their brotherhood, of the pain that tore his heart when his companion was taken. He confesses his fear of death, his horror at the silence of the grave, his longing to escape the fate that claims all men. He declares that he has come across mountains and seas, through darkness and fire, guided by Siduri and ferried by Urshanabi, only to stand now before the one who holds the secret of eternal life. His words spill out in a torrent, raw and desperate, for in this moment he feels that all rests upon the answer he will receive. Utnapishtim listens without interruption. He regards Gilgamesh with patient eyes, allowing the king to empty his heart of its grief and its questions. When Gilgamesh at last falls silent, Utnapishtim speaks. His voice is quiet, yet it carries a weight that bends the air around it. He tells Gilgamesh that his quest is not unique, that every man before him has sought to escape the hand of death, and every man after him will do the same. Death, he says, is the destiny the gods have set for mankind. Life they have given, yet everlasting life they have withheld. The immortality he himself carries is not the fruit of his own strength, nor the prize of conquest, but a rare exception granted by divine decree. It was not earned, but bestowed, and it cannot be given again. Gilgamesh protests, for his heart cannot accept this answer. He declares that he is not like other men, that he has achieved greatness, that he has fought monsters and built walls that will outlast generations. Should not such deeds be rewarded? Should not the one who surpasses others in might and renown be spared from the common fate? But Utnapishtim shakes his head. He tells him that the measure of greatness does not bend the laws of life and death. Kings and beggars alike return to the earth, and the river of time carries them away without distinction. Even Gilgamesh, mighty as he is, cannot alter what the gods have decreed. Yet seeing the depth of Gilgamesh's anguish, Utnapishtim does not dismiss him outright. Instead, he chooses to test him, to show him the truth of his own condition. He tells Gilgamesh that if he wishes to grasp immortality, he must first prove himself capable of mastering the simplest trial, to conquer the power of sleep. For sleep, Utnapishtim explains, is the shadow twin of death, and if Gilgamesh cannot resist its pull, how can he hope to overcome the greater silence? Gilgamesh accepts eagerly, confident in his strength, certain that his will can defy even the weakness of the body. He sits down, vowing to remain awake, to prove that he is worthy of the secret he seeks. But no sooner has he settled himself than the weight of his long journey begins to press upon him. His eyes grow heavy, his limbs slacken, and though he struggles, though he clenches his fists and steels his mind, the tide of sleep overtakes him. He drifts into slumber, deep and unbroken, while Utnapishtim watches in silence. Hours pass, then days, and Gilgamesh does not stir. At last, when he awakens, he believes he has conquered the trial, certain that he has kept himself awake. But Utnapishtim shows him the loaves of bread baked each day as he slept, each one hardened by time, each marking the passage he could not deny. Shame falls upon Gilgamesh, for he sees that even in this small challenge, he has failed. Utnapishtim speaks again, telling him that this failure reveals a greater truth. If he cannot master sleep, how can he master death? If his body succumbs so easily to weariness, how can it resist the grave? The lesson is plain. Mortality is not an enemy to be conquered, but a condition woven into the fabric of life. Gilgamesh sits in silence, his heart heavy, yet within his sorrow a new understanding begins to stir. He sees now that immortality is not his to claim, that the fate he flees cannot be outrun. Still, he clings to hope, asking if there is no gift, no chance, no path left open to him. And in this moment, Utnapishtim, moved by his sincerity, prepares to reveal something more, a secret of the deep waters, a mystery hidden from men, that may yet offer Gilgamesh a glimpse of the eternal. Gilgamesh sits in quiet despair, humbled by his failure to resist even the pull of sleep. Yet Utnapishtim, though resolute in his lessons, looks upon him with a trace of compassion. He speaks of a secret, not the gift of eternal life itself, but a mystery of the deep waters, a hidden plant that holds the power to renew youth. This plant, he explains, lies at the bottom of the sea, its thorns sharp, its stalk curled, its taste bitter, yet its gift beyond measure. Whoever takes it and consumes it may feel the strength of youth return, even as the years have pressed upon them. Though not immortality, it is a chance to begin again, a glimpse of renewal where none seemed possible. Hearing this, Gilgamesh feels a spark of hope return, faint yet alive, like a flicker of light in a vast darkness. Guided by Utnapishtim's words, he ties heavy stones to his feet and lowers himself into the waters. The sea is cold and endless, pressing against him with a force that seeks to drag him down into silence. His lungs burn, yet he pushes onward, reaching deeper, until at last his hands find the stalk of the plant. He seizes it, though its thorns cut into his skin, and tears it free from the silted floor of the deep. Rising again, he bursts through the surface of the waters, gasping for air, yet triumphant. In his hands, he holds the treasure he has sought, not immortality, but a renewal that might restore the vigor of youth to himself and to the weary people of Uruk. For in his heart, he imagines not only himself rejuvenated, but also his city renewed, his people granted the gift of vitality. He sees in this plant a way to lift his nation above despair. Cradling the plant, he speaks to Urshanabi, the ferryman who has waited patiently. He tells him of his plan, that he will return to Uruk, share the plant's gift with the old and the weak, and then partake of it himself. In this way, He will not hoard its power but allow all to taste renewal before him. For in this act, Gilgamesh believes, he will find meaning beyond his own fear, and perhaps this will be the immortality he can truly claim. The memory of a king who brought life back to his people. His heart swells with purpose, for after so long wandering in grief and emptiness, he feels for the first time a vision that carries both hope and selflessness. The journey home begins, and for the first time in many days, Gilgamesh's steps feel lighter. The plant rests carefully wrapped, a fragile treasure, yet one that fills his mind with anticipation. As he and Urshanabi walk together, Gilgamesh speaks not of loss, but of plans for the future. He imagines the faces of his people, astonished and grateful, as the old regain the strength of youth, as children laugh to see their elders walking with vigor. He envisions celebrations at the gates of Uruk, the people gathered as he, their king, delivers this gift of renewal. In this dream, he sees Enkidu too, as though alive once more, smiling among the crowd, his laughter rising above the music of the festival. Though Gilgamesh knows this is but a vision, it comforts him, and he holds the plant tighter, unwilling to let go of its promise. But the journey home is long, and the road passes through quiet places where the world pays no heed to the hopes of men. At one such place, weary from travel, Gilgamesh and Urshanabi stop to rest beside a cool spring. The waters glisten in the sun, inviting and calm, and Gilgamesh lowers himself to bathe, leaving the plant wrapped securely nearby. As he washes the dust of travel from his skin, a serpent stirs, drawn by the scent of the hidden treasure. Silent and swift, it slithers toward the bundle, its tongue flickering, its body coiled with purpose. With one swift motion, it seizes the plant, biting through its wrappings, and swallows it whole. At once, the serpent sheds its skin, renewed, glistening in fresh youth, and disappears into the grass. When Gilgamesh returns, his heart stops at the sight of the empty space where the plant once lay. He cries out in despair, his voice echoing across the still waters. All his efforts, all his trials, all his sorrows seem now for nothing. The gift of youth is gone, carried away by a creature that will never understand the treasure it has taken. The serpent, indifferent to human longing, goes on with its life, renewed, while Gilgamesh is left with nothing but empty hands. He throws himself upon the ground, tears rising unbidden, and weeps for the loss. In his grief, he curses the serpent, yet curses too his own fate, for once again he has been denied the escape he sought. The promise of renewal has slipped through his grasp, and he feels the weight of mortality press upon him heavier than ever. Yet as his weeping subsides, Gilgamesh begins to feel something shift within him. The plant is gone, the dream undone, but his journey is not meaningless. He reflects upon all he has endured, the loss of Enkidu, the long roads, the counsel of Siduri, the trial of sleep, and the wisdom of Utnapishtim. Each moment, though painful, has carried him toward understanding. The serpent's theft is a cruel reminder, yet it also speaks of the truth he has been resisting. Life cannot be held forever. Its gifts are fleeting, its joys fragile, its treasures vulnerable to loss. And yet, within their very impermanence lies their worth. What is precious if not that which cannot last? What meaning would life hold if it stretched on without end? Rising to his feet, Gilgamesh wipes the tears from his face. The path ahead now leads home, back to Uruk, not with the gift of youth, not with immortality, but with a heart transformed by the wisdom of his journey. He gathers his strength and begins walking once more, carrying with him not the plant, but a deeper understanding of what it means to live and what it means to be remembered. Though the gods have denied him eternal life, they have granted him something else, the chance to see with clearer eyes and to choose how he will spend the days that remain. And so Gilgamesh sets his gaze upon the horizon, where the walls of Uruk await, strong and enduring, ready to welcome their king once more. The road to Uruk stretches long before Gilgamesh, but now he walks it not with frantic haste nor with despairing grief, but with a steadier heart. The weight of the plant's loss still lingers, yet its absence has opened his eyes to truths he had long resisted. As he returns across the lands he once crossed in restless urgency, the world feels different. The mountains rise calm and immovable, the rivers wind with patient grace, and the trees stand in silent witness, their roots deep in the soil of countless generations. Gilgamesh senses that each thing endures not because it defies death, but because it exists fully in its own time. The mountains crumble slowly, the rivers shift their courses, the trees sprout and fall, and yet life continues in the pattern of renewal. He begins to see himself not as a figure apart from this rhythm, but as one bound within it. Urshanabi, walking by his side, listens as Gilgamesh reflects aloud on his journey. He speaks of Enkidu, whose life was brief yet filled with meaning, whose companionship gave him joys and lessons that shaped him forever. He recalls Siduri, whose words urged him to savor the bread, the wine, and the love of life's fleeting moments. He remembers Utnapishtim, whose stillness revealed the futility of resisting the fate set for all men. Each figure along his path now seems not a barrier, but a guide, each encounter a fragment of wisdom pressing him toward acceptance. Gilgamesh, once consumed by grief and terror, now feels a slow peace rising in him. As they draw nearer to Uruk, the sight of its towering walls greets him once more. The sun catches upon the baked brick, casting long shadows that stretch across the plain. In those walls, Gilgamesh sees not only stone but the labor of hands, the vision of rulers, and the endurance of a people who sought permanence in the face of mortality. He realizes that this creation, this vast ring of stone embracing the city, is his true legacy, not because it grants him eternity, but because it shelters generations to come. The walls stand as a testament that human effort, though mortal, can shape something that endures beyond a single lifetime. Approaching the gates, Gilgamesh pauses to gaze upon the city. He watches children running through the streets, their laughter carried on the air, old men leaning upon staffs, women carrying baskets of bread and jars of water, craftsmen laboring at their trades, priests lifting incense toward the heavens. Each life is brief, fragile, yet together they weave a tapestry of continuity. The city does not endure because any one man lives forever, but because countless lives, each finite, join into a greater whole. In this vision, Gilgamesh sees the answer he sought. Immortality lies not in defiance of death, but in the memory of what one leaves behind, in the marks carved upon the world by human hands, in the stories told long after one's body returns to dust. He walks through the gates, greeted by his people, who bow before their king. They see in him not the despairing figure who left them in grief, but a ruler tempered by wisdom. He does not tell them of the plant he lost nor of the serpent that stole it, for he knows such a tale would only bring sorrow. Instead, he speaks of the strength of Uruk, of the greatness of its walls, of the works yet to be built, and of the lives that will flourish within its embrace. He tells them that to live well is not to chase eternity, but to shape the days one is given with care, courage, and love. His words carry the calm authority of one who has seen the farthest shores and returned with truth. In the evenings, he walks the walls of the city, gazing out over the land. The stars rise above him, countless and unending, a vast reminder of the heavens that watch over all. He no longer sees them with longing for their permanence, but with reverence for their beauty. Each night they shine, yet each dawn they fade, only to return again. They, too, live in rhythm, and their cycle mirrors his own. He feels the quiet acceptance of this pattern settle within him. The fear of death, though not erased, no longer consumes him, for he has learned that fear cannot add a single day to life, but it can rob a man of the joy found in the present. From time to time, he speaks Enkidu's name softly, not as a cry of grief, but as a remembrance. He tells his people of Enkidu's bravery, his laughter, his loyalty, so that the memory of his friend lives on not only in his own heart, but in the voices of others. In this way, Enkidu becomes immortal, carried in the stories of Uruk, shaping its people long after his body has gone. Gilgamesh realizes that this, too, is a form of life everlasting, not to walk forever upon the earth, but to be remembered in the hearts and songs of those who follow. Seasons pass, and Gilgamesh continues his reign. He oversees new works, strengthens the city, and guides his people with a wisdom born of his trials. Yet always, he returns to the walls, to gaze upon the enduring stones. They are his answer to the god's decree, his way of shaping something larger than himself. In them, he sees the truth that he could not find in distant seas or hidden plants. Immortality does not belong to man, but meaning does, and meaning is carved in the works, the love, and the memories one leaves behind. And so Gilgamesh, once restless and consumed by fear, becomes a king who accepts the fate of man, yet does not bow to despair. His journey ends not with the gift of eternal life, but with the greater gift of understanding. He has traveled across the edges of the world, spoken with immortals, failed in trials, and lost treasures. But in the end, he has found the truth waiting not in distant lands, but in the heart of his own city, and in the walls that stand strong against the turning of time. The story of Gilgamesh draws toward its close, not with the thunder of gods or the triumph of eternal youth, but with a quiet stillness that carries greater power than conquest. The mighty king who once strode into the wilderness in terror of death now walks the walls of Uruk with acceptance in his heart. The tale that began with restlessness and pride ends with reflection and wisdom. It is in this ending that the meaning of the epic is revealed, and it is in these final moments that the story offers its gift not only to the people of Uruk, but to all who listen across the ages. When one gazes upon the walls of Uruk, as Gilgamesh once invited us to do, one sees not merely brick and mortar, but the labor of countless hands guided by a vision larger than any one man. The walls are high, their stones shaped with skill, their lines stretching toward the horizon, encircling the city like a crown. They are not eternal, for in time even stone crumbles, but they endure long enough to remind generations of the greatness of their builder. In this, Gilgamesh has found the immortality that is available to all humans, the immortality of legacy. His story, carved into the clay tablets that bear his name, has survived far beyond the years of his reign. Though his body rests with the countless kings and shepherds of old, his voice continues, carried into the present. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest tale we possess, a story preserved in fragments of cuneiform, rediscovered by archaeologists, and pieced together across centuries. Yet its questions remain as fresh as the day they were first inscribed. What does it mean to be human? How does one face death? Where does one find meaning in a life that cannot last forever? Gilgamesh wrestled with these questions, and in doing so, he speaks for all who have ever wondered at the brevity of life. His answers may not soothe every fear, but they offer a path toward peace. To live fully in the days one is given, to love and to labor, to create and to remember. This is the way mortality is transformed into meaning. The death of Enkidu was the wound that set this story into motion. In his grief, Gilgamesh sought to escape death itself, but in his journey he learned that grief and death are not foes to be conquered, but companions that remind us of life's value. Through Enkidu, he discovered friendship, love, and the power of human bonds. Through Enkidu's loss, he discovered that even sorrow can teach, that even pain can shape wisdom. The story is, in the end, as much about Enkidu as about Gilgamesh, for without his companion, the king would never have found the truths that define his reign. And so the epic closes with a quiet turning inward. Gilgamesh no longer seeks distant horizons, no longer begs the gods for more years than he is given. He has come to see that eternity is not to be grasped by human hands. Instead, he looks to his city, to the walls that will endure long after him, and to the stories his people will tell. For what is immortality if not the remembrance of one's deeds, the echo of one's voice, and the love one leaves behind? In the whispers of future generations, in the stones shaped by human effort, in the tales repeated at night beneath the stars, Gilgamesh lives on. The tale ends, but the telling does not. From clay tablets buried in desert sands to libraries across the world, the story has traveled farther than even Gilgamesh himself once dared. He sought to cross seas and mountains, yet his true voyage carried him across time, carried by the words etched in clay, preserved by chance and diligence. Tonight, as his story is spoken once more, it joins the countless voices of human history, voices that reach across centuries to remind us that though we are mortal, our words and our love may endure. In this way, The Epic of Gilgamesh is not only the story of a king, but the story of us all. Each listener, resting as the tale unfolds, carries within them the same questions Gilgamesh once bore. Each listener knows the fear of loss, the desire for more time, the longing for permanence. And each listener, like Gilgamesh, can find peace in the simple truth that life's meaning does not depend on its length, but on its depth. To love deeply, to create with care, to leave behind something worthy. These are the treasures more enduring than stone, more lasting than youth. So as the story closes, let the voice of Gilgamesh fade into silence, but let its lessons remain. Let us walk the walls of our own lives, gazing upon what we have built, however small, however imperfect, and see in them the mark of our existence. Let us remember that mortality is not a punishment but a reminder, urging us to savor the bread, the wine, the laughter, and the bonds we share. Let us remember that even kings cannot escape the grave, but in their deeds, in their friendships, and in their stories, they live on. And tonight, as the tale of Gilgamesh and Enkidu comes to rest, may it bring you not fear but calm, not despair but reflection, not restlessness but peace. Close your eyes as the ancient city of Uruk fades into the horizon, its walls standing tall against the night. Hear the echo of footsteps upon stone, the murmur of a king who once sought eternity, and the soft hush of a world that endures. Let the story be your companion as sleep drifts near, carrying you gently into dreams, where even in their brevity, moments shine with timeless light. The story rests now, yet its echoes linger, like the fading notes of a song that continues to hum in the memory long after the music has ended. Gilgamesh, the restless king who set out to defy death, has returned to Uruk, and with him we, too, return from the long journey through ancient time. His footsteps may no longer be heard upon the earth, yet the path he walked is still before us, carved in words that outlasted fire, flood, and the passing of empires. In the quiet of night, as sleep approaches, his voice drifts closer, reminding us that stories are not bound by lifespans. They cross generations, carrying with them the wisdom of those who lived long ago, into the ears of those who dream tonight. The Epic of Gilgamesh survives because it speaks to what is unchanging in the human heart. Empires rise and fall, languages fade into silence, the stones of temples crumble into dust, yet the longing to be remembered, the fear of loss, the search for meaning. These are the threads that tie us to the people of Uruk as surely as if we had walked their streets. When Gilgamesh gazed upon the walls of his city, he hoped they would endure. When scribes pressed his story into clay, they hoped their words would be read. And here, thousands of years later, we fulfill that hope. Their voices have crossed deserts of time, and in listening, we keep them alive. For in the end, immortality takes many forms. It is not the endless beating of a heart, nor the refusal of the body to grow old, but the endurance of memory, of love, of the tale retold. The serpent may have stolen the plant, but not even the serpent can steal the story. The plant renewed only the body, but the story renews the spirit. Each telling breathes life again into Gilgamesh and Enkidu, into their laughter, their battles, their grief, and their hard-won wisdom. Every time the epic is spoken, they rise anew, not in flesh, but in remembrance. And as we sit with their story, we, too, are changed. We hear Siduri's counsel, reminding us to eat the bread, to drink the wine, to hold the hands of those we love. We walk with Gilgamesh across the dark road, feeling the weight of his sorrow and the pull of his questions, until we share in the peace he finds at last. We mourn with him the loss of Enkidu, yet we also smile to remember their joy, their wild friendship that made even kings laugh like children. We may close the book, we may let the voice fade, but the wisdom remains with us, stitched quietly into our own reflections. In the stillness of night, the lessons grow clearer. The story reminds us that we are not so different from those who lived before. We build, we love, we lose, we wonder, we seek meaning in fleeting time. The walls of Uruk stand as a metaphor for every effort we make to outlast ourselves. The songs sung at a fire, the words written on a page, the small acts of kindness that ripple beyond us. All are bricks in the walls of memory, shaping a structure that stands even as we pass away. And perhaps, like Gilgamesh, we need not despair at the thought of death, but instead take comfort in the truth that our lives contribute to something greater, something enduring. So as the epic closes, let us take its lesson gently into our own rest. The night sky above us, like the heavens over ancient Mesopotamia, reminds us of our place in the vastness of time. The stars we see tonight are the same that Gilgamesh once saw from the walls of Uruk, the same that Enkidu looked upon in the wilderness. They have watched over countless lives, countless stories, and they will continue long after ours are told. Yet within their endless shining, the brevity of our lives is not a loss, but a gift, for it makes each moment precious. The story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu does not end in despair. It ends with acceptance, with the strength to live well and to be remembered well. And so it offers us a gentle reminder that though we cannot stop the passing of time, we can choose how to spend it. We can choose to love, to build, to dream, to tell stories that will outlast us. In doing so, we claim a place in the memory of those who follow, just as Gilgamesh claimed his place in ours. And now, as the tale settles into silence, let its rhythm guide you toward rest. Let the walls of Uruk fade slowly in your mind, the sun setting over their ancient stones. Let the voices of Gilgamesh and Enkidu drift into the distance, their laughter echoing faintly, their friendship enduring even beyond death. Let your own thoughts quiet, as though the clay tablets themselves close softly, sealing the story for another night. And as sleep approaches, remember that the story waits patiently, ready to be told again, as it has for thousands of years, as it will for thousands more. The night is calm. The story is complete. The journey is over. May the wisdom of Gilgamesh bring you peace, and may his story be a gentle companion as you drift into dreams.